November 1883, River Basin, Wyoming Territory. The cabin looked wrong. That's what everyone said when they first saw it. Half buried into the hillside like something trying to hide. The roof barely clearing the sagebrush, stone walls disappearing into earth, no proper chimney, no second story. Just a low squat structure that seemed to crouch against the coming winter. Sarah Drummond built it that way on purpose. The question wasn't whether she was crazy. Most folks had already decided that. The question was whether she'd survive her first winter in it. Because winter in the basin didn't forgive mistakes, and according to every carpenter, every homesteader, every man who'd built anything in Wyoming Territory, Sarah had made nothing but mistakes. The cold was already settling in, early snow had dusted the peaks. Cottonwoods along the creek had dropped their leaves 2 weeks ahead of schedule. Old-timers were saying it would be a hard season, the kind that separated the prepared from a dead. Sarah's neighbors were stocking firewood, cords and cords of it, cottonwood, pine, whatever burnt. Because everyone knew the formula, small cabin needs 3 cords minimum, larger cabin 5 or 6, you ran out of wood, you froze. But Sarah wasn't cutting wood, she was packing dirt. If you're watching this from somewhere warm, hit that subscribe button because what Sarah understood about Earth and cold is something that could save your life one day, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to know. How many of you are facing real winter right now? Sarah Drummond wasn't from Wyoming. She'd come west from Pennsylvania after her husband died in a mill accident. 28 years old, no family, homestead claim in her name, 160 acres of sagebrush and wind. The local method for building was simple: timber frame, board walls, shake roof. Stack it to stories if you could afford the lumber. Big fireplace, tight windows, burn wood from September to May. Sarah had 2 problems with that method. First, there weren't many trees on her claim. The nearest timber was 6 miles north, and she didn't have a wagon yet. Hauling logs on foot wasn't realistic, not enough, not in time. Second, she'd done the math on firewood. 3 cords minimum meant cutting, splitting, and stacking roughly 380 for cubic feet of wood. For a woman working alone, that was 2 months of labor, maybe 3, and winter was 8 weeks out. So she did something that seemed insane. She dug into the hill, not a root cellar, not a dugout for storage, an actual living space, excavated back into the south-facing slope behind her land, about 12 feet deep into stable clay and sandstone. The walls were earth, the ceiling was supported by salvaged railroad ties she'd traded work for. The front wall, the only wall exposed to air, was stacked fieldstone and clay mortar. 1 small window, 1 low door, roof covered with 8 inch of sod, grass still growing on top. Inside, she carved sleeping platform into the back wall, storage niches, a small firebox, not even a real stove, just fire brick and a makeshift flue that vented through the roof. The whole structure used maybe 1/10 the wood of a normal cabin. But here's what mattered, what nobody else was seeing. She'd built it into the thermal mass of the earth itself. Soil temperature 6 feet down stays stable year-round. In Wyoming, that's roughly 45 to 50 F, not warm, but not freezing. The ground doesn't care what the air temperature is, it holds steady. Sarah's cabin wasn't fighting the cold. It was borrowing the earth's stored heat. The thick earthen walls acted as a battery, moderating temperature swings. The sod roof provided insulation. The south-facing stone wall caught winter sun during the day, absorbed it, radiated it back at night. She wasn't planning to heat the space from 20 to 70. She was planning to boost it from 48 to 65. Totally different equation, totally different fuel requirement. But try explaining that to a homesteader who'd been burning 6 cords a winter for 20 years. The criticism started before she'd even finished the roof. Jacob Weatherby, the man whose land adjoined hers to the east, rode over one afternoon and just stared. Sarah was tamping the sod layers, packing them tight. "You planning to live in that?" he asked. "I am. Looks like a gopher mound. Gophers do fine in winter." He didn't laugh. "You know what happens when snowmelt hits? That whole thing will turn a mud soup, front walls slump. You'll drown in your sleep. Sarah kept packing. Drainage runs downhill. I cut channels. You're going to freeze. Maybe you got no chim dam. No. Ventilation. You'll suffocate or freeze. One or the other. She looked up. I appreciate the concern. He shook his head. Concerns got nothing to do with it. Just want to dig your body out come spring. Word spread fast. By late October, Sarah's hole in the ground was the running joke at the supply store in Lander. Men she'd never met had opinions. A carpenter named Hughes, who'd built half the cabins in the basin, made a point of riding out to see himself. He walked the perimeter, kicked the front wall, ducked inside for maybe 10 seconds. When he came out, he said, "This isn't a cabin. It's a grave you're going to freeze in, and I'll tell you why. You got no draft for that firebox. Smoke's going to hang in there like fog. You got no real insulation between you and that dirt. Moisture's in a wick right through freeze on the inside walls turn the whole place into an ice box. And that sod roof first heavy snow will collapse it right on top of you." He looked at her like she was a child who tried to build a clock out of rocks. "I've built in this territory for 16 years. I know it works. This doesn't." Even the women were skeptical, though they were quieter about it. At the Sunday gathering, Sarah overheard one of them, Mary Calloway, talking to another homesteader's wife. "Poor thing doesn't know any better. Came out here alone, doesn't listen. A woman can't just dig a hole and call a home. She'll be begging for a bed in someone's barn by Christmas." The worst part wasn't a doubt, it was the pity. They'd already written her off. The storm came the second week of December. It started as wind, cold, steady, relentless, the kind that found every gap in every wall, every crack in every door. By the second day, snow followed, not the light. Dry powder of early winter, heavy wet snow that stuck to everything. Temperature dropped to 11 Fahrenheit the first night, then 6, then on the third night, -4. Across the basin, homesteaders were burning wood as fast as they could split it. Fires roaring day and night, families huddled close to stoves, layering blankets, stuffing rags into window frames. Jacob Weatherby went through half a cord in 3 days. His cabin, well built by any standard, couldn't hold heat. The wind stripped it away every time he opened the door to bring in more wood. The temperature inside dropped 10. His children slept in their coats. Hughes, the carpenter, had a bigger place, better insulated. He burned slower but steadier. Still, he was feeding his stove every 4 hours through the night. His wife kept the kettle boiling just to add moisture to the air, which had turned bone dry from constant fire. At the supply store, men started trading for green wood, anything that would burn. Desperation math. By day 5, some families were burning furniture. And then someone asked, anyone checked on the Drummond woman? No one had. Weatherby volunteered, mostly out of obligation. He figured he'd find her either frozen or gone, maybe taking shelter elsewhere. He rode out on the 6th day. Snow still falling, wind still cutting. When he crested the hill above her claim, he saw smoke, thin, barely visible, not the thick, black column of a roaring fire. Just a whisper. He dismounted, walked her door, and knocked. Sarah opened it. She was in a wool shirt, no coat, hair dry, skin not chapped. Behind her, the interior glowed dim and warm. "You all right, Weatherby?" asked. "Fine. You?" He stepped closer, felt the air coming from inside, warm, not hot, but warm. "Steady. How much would you burning?" "Maybe 1 small log a day, sometimes 2. He stared. "That's not possible. Come see for yourself." He stepped inside. The space was maybe 12 by 14 feet. Low ceiling, but the air was still dry. Warm enough that he could feel his fingers thaw. The firebox held coals, just coals. No active flame. "You've been burning this whole time, off and on." "Mostly off. How are you not frozen?" Sarah gestured to the walls, the earth around them. "Ground doesn't freeze, stays about 50. Maybe a little less. I'm not heating from 0. I'm heating from 50. 1 fire in the morning, 1 at night if it's really cold. That's it." Weatherby touched the back wall. Dirt but dry, stable, warm to the touch like it was holding heat. "The earth stores it," Sarah said. "I don't need to keep A fire going, I just need to bump the temperature a few degrees and the ground holds it there. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then how long's that firebox been out? Since yesterday afternoon, it was still warm inside. Stay with me because the number Sarah's cabin pulled off humiliated every builder in the basin. And if you're enjoying this, hit that like button and drop a comment. I want to hear from you. By the time the storm broke, Sarah had burned less than 1/10 of a cord of wood, maybe 80 pieces total, split small, burned slow. Jacob Weatherby had burned 4 cords. Hughes, the carpenter, 3.5. The difference wasn't effort, it was physics. A standard timber cabin in Wyoming winter loses heat 3 ways: conduction through the walls, convection through gaps and drafts, and radiation out of windows. You're fighting outdoor air that might be 0 or lower. The only thing between you and that air is wood, which has an R value of about 1.4 per inch. A typical wall might give you R10 if you're lucky. You're hemorrhaging BTS. Sarah's cabin didn't fight outdoor air. It sat inside the thermal mass of the earth, which at 6 feet deep held a consistent 48 def. The dirt walls, packed tight, had an effective R value closer to R20 or R25, depending on moisture content and density, but more importantly, they weren't losing heat to freezing wind, they were insulated by more earth. The sod roof added another R10 to R15, and because it was covered with snow during the storm, that added even more insulation. When Sarah lit a fire, she wasn't trying to raise the interior temperature from 0 to 65. She was raising it from 48 to 65, a 17 boost instead of a 65 boost. That's why one log worked. The thermal mass of the surrounding earth absorbed the heat from her fire and rerolling it slowly over ours. The firebox didn't need to stay lit. The walls themselves became a heater during the coldest night of the storm. When outside air hit -4 the temperature inside Sarah's cabin never dropped below 52. Not warm enough for comfort without a blanket, but well above freezing safe. Weatherby's cabin, by comparison, dropped to 38 overnight despite a fire burning 3 days after the storm. A group of homesteaders came to see it for themselves. Hughes was among them. He brought a thermometer, exterior temperature, 19 F interior temperature. Firebox cold for 6 hours, 56. He stood there staring at the numbers, then at the dirt walls. I'll be damned, he said quietly. One of the other men, a homesteader named Chatwood, asked the question everyone was thinking. How much did this cost you to build? Sarah calculated. In her head, timber for supports, maybe $12, stone I gathered, mortar, $3, tools I already had. Total outlay $15 and about 3 weeks of work. Chatwood's cabin had cost him $200 in lumber alone. The math was ugly for everyone who'd done it the traditional way. Hughes walked the perimeter again, this time slower, looking at details he dismissed before. The drainage channel sheet cut, the angle of the south wall to catch winter sun, the sod layers compacted and sealed. I called this a grave, he said, not looking at her. I was wrong. The change didn't happen overnight, but it happened. By February 1884, 3 homesteaders within 10 miles of Sarah's claim had started modifying their cabins. Not full earth-sheltered builds, but adaptations, banking earth against north walls, adding sod layers to roofs, angling structures into hillsides instead of building flat on exposed ground. Chatwood, the man who'd asked about cost, went furthest. He dug a new root cellar, but extended it, turned it into a winter room, 8 by 10 feet, carved into a slopestone front wall with a small iron stove. His family slept there January through March. He later told people it cut his with consumption by 60%. Hughes, the carpenter who called Sarah's cabin a grave, didn't build one himself. But when a newly married couple contracted him for a homestead cabin that spring, he suggested they consider a partial earth berm on the north side. Adds thermal mass, he said, keeps you warmer with less fuel. He didn't mention where he'd learned that. By 1886, the basin had 11 structures using some form of earth sheltering or thermal mass integration. Some were full dugouts like Sarah's, others were hybrid designs, half buried, front wall exposed. A few were just traditional cabins with 6 ft of earth piled against the back and sides. They all stayed warmer. They all burned less wood. The technique didn't have a name yet. People just called it building smart or building like Drummond. Sarah stayed in her cabin for 4 more winters. She eventually built a second structure above ground for warmer months and storage. But every November, she moved back into the earth, warm, dry, stable. The ground never let her down. In 1889, a surveyor from the Territorial Land Office came through documenting homesteads. He noted Sarah's cabin in his report, called it ingeniously engineered for fuel efficiency and thermal stability. He sketched the cross-section. That sketch ended up in a file in Cheyenne where it sat for decades. But the idea didn't need a government file to spread. It spread because it worked. Here's what Sarah understood that most people missed. Cold isn't something you fight with brute force. It's something you manage with physics. The Earth doesn't care about air temperature 6 feet down. It's stable. 45 to 50 year-round, everywhere from Wyoming to Canada to Scandinavia. That's free thermal mass, free insulation, free stability. Modern building science has confirmed what Sarah approved in 1883. Earth-sheltered homes, when designed correctly, can reduce heating costs by 50 to 90% compared to conventional structures. The ground acts as a thermal battery. It absorbs heat in summer, releases it in winter. It buffers temperature swings. It doesn't burn. It doesn't rot. It doesn't need maintenance. The challenge was never the physics. The physics worked fine. The challenge was convincing people that something unfamiliar could be smarter than something traditional. Sarah didn't convince anyone with words. She convinced them with winter, with numbers, with the simple, undeniable fact that her cabin stayed warm while theirs didn't. And here's the part that matters for you watching this now. The principles Sarah used aren't historical curiosities. They're active applicable physics. If you're building off-grid, if you're trying to reduce energy dependence, if you're in a climate with serious winters, the ground beneath you is an asset you're probably ignoring. You don't need to live in a hole, but you can borrow the idea. Earth BMS, thermal mass walls, subgrade construction, passive solar orientation. These aren't primitive techniques, they're efficient ones. Sarah Drummond wasn't a trained engineer. She was a widow with a land claim and a math problem. She looked at what she had, dirt and stone and sun, and she built a system that worked. The people who mocked her weren't stupid, they just couldn't see past what they'd always done. Innovation doesn't always look like progress. Sometimes it looks like a woman packing dirt on a roof, while the neighbors laugh until winter comes and then the numbers speak. So here's my question for you. Where are you watching this from? And what's the coldest winter you've ever faced? Drop it in the comments. I want to know who out there is dealing with real cold. The kind that makes you think about every BTU. And if you got something out of this story, hit that subscribe button. Every week I bring you one technique, one piece of forgotten knowledge, one solution that worked when survival actually depended on it. Because the smartest ideas don't always come from the loudest voices. Sometimes they come from the quiet ones, packing dirt, doing math, and waiting for winter to prove them.